Okay, just about ready to start. Um, Today is Sunday before Passover, but it's also the 11th of Nisan. It's a big day for the world Jewry and for the Hasidim. It's the birthday of the Rebbe, the 118th birthday. So I think we'll begin with maybe something, a teaching from the Rebbe, and about the beginning of the Torah. So we know everyone knows the beginning. Maybe one of the most famous verses in the Torah is Bereshit bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. But there is a medrash that discusses this phrase because it turns out if you're going to write Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, it turns out the Torah begins with the letter Bet, with the second letter of the alphabet. Now, the Medrash discusses this question and asks, why doesn't the Torah begin with an Aleph? If you look at the Ten Commandments begin with an Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And that makes sense because Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, so we would assume that the Aleph is the beginning, and therefore Aleph is the first letter of the Ten Commandments. But why is it that the Torah begins with the second letter of the alphabet, not with the first letter of the alphabet? So there is a Medrash, and the Medrash explains that the letter Aleph was offended. The letter Aleph was offended, asking why did the Torah begin with the second letter, skipping the first letter? So the letter Aleph was offended. So God wanted to pacify the letter Aleph. So therefore, God placed Aleph as the first letter of the Ten Commandments. And now Aleph is happy as well. Very beautiful, wonderful medrash. Everybody's happy. Everybody gets paid back. But of course, there's spiritual significance to all of this, which we will try to explain. There's an interesting story. And okay, before the story, the Hasidic interpretation of why the Torah starts with a bet is as follows. What is the letter bet? The letter bet is the letter 2. So something about the study of the Torah is number 2, which means that there's something that precedes the Torah, right? So we're beginning the Torah again. We open up the book. You would expect to start with an Aleph, with the beginning. But we say, no, this is already number 2. There is something that precedes the Torah. So what precedes the Torah? So one way to think about it is that the Torah has various elements. The Torah has wisdom, and the Torah has insight. But even before the Torah has wisdom, the Torah also has something that's we would call the spirituality of the Torah. The fact that the Torah is the wisdom of God. In other words, that when we study the Torah, it connects us with God. And that is something that sort of precedes the Torah. Before you study Torah, you have to understand and recognize that even though you're about to engage in wisdom, but the wisdom is only number 2. The wisdom is predicated on divine will, which is actually transcends wisdom. And from there, you can move to the wisdom. That's the Hasidic interpretation. Now, there's a fascinating story in the Talmud. The Talmud explains that there was the king Ptolemy in English, and he wanted to get the real version of the Torah. He understood that the Jewish people, when they tell him the translation of the Torah, who knows, they may be manipulating the translation. He wanted an authentic translation. He didn't want the Torah to go through any sort of filters. So he gathers 70 rabbis together, and he puts them in 70 different rooms without telling them why he is gathering them. And then he tells each one, translate the Torah of Moses, your teacher. And he understands that if they try to change what the Torah says and give a false translation, it's going to emerge because not all 70 are going to make the same change. And then he'll see where the discrepancies are. Says the Talmud, a miracle, doesn't say a miracle happened, but they all got I guess maybe it was a miracle. Yeah, it does say, it says God gave insight into all 70 rabbis, and they all, of course, they're not going to give him the original Torah because who knows how he'll make that. You'll see in a moment that will cause him to make a mistake. So they made 15 changes, but they all made the same 15 changes. That was the miracle. That was the insight. So when he got the Torah, he got what he thought was an authentic version, but it wasn't really an authentic version. In other words, it was mistranslated, but it wasn't really a mistake because, again, sometimes the authentic translation would have led him to make a mistake, as we will explain. So there are 15 examples. I'm not going to run through all 15. We'll talk about the first. The first is the one relevant to us. It says as follows: Bereshit bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. If you read it literally, it could sound like Bereshit, the beginning, bara, created, Elokim, God. So if you translate it literally, the statement says, the beginning created God. So the rabbis understood we cannot give Talmai this version of the Torah because then he'll say the beginning created God, and it will lead him to a mistake of what the definition of God is. In other words, that God is a created being. In the beginning, time precedes God. So all 70, without having text messages, without being able to corroborate one with the other, all 70 made a change. What did they change it to? Instead of Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, they switched the order. God created in the beginning. Instead of in the beginning God created, really in the Hebrew it's in the beginning. In the beginning created God, it's God created in the beginning. Elokim bara Bereshit. That's the story. And it was a wonderful story. Everybody agreed, and there's another 14, the total of 15 changes. And there's a whole story how the rabbis thought that was a bad day because they had to translate the Torah and they had to make the changes. It wasn't a great day. But in any case, what's the takeaway from the story, from the Hasidic perspective? The takeaway from the story is, it's fascinating. When Talmai read the Torah Talmai read started with an aleph because they changed it to Elokim bara Bereshit. God created in the beginning. So it does start with Elokim, with God. It starts with the aleph. So there's something interesting here. When the Jew studies Torah, Torah starts with a bet, with number 2, second letter of the alphabet. Because the second letter of the alphabet, as we said from the Hasidic perspective, from the Kabbalistic perspective, represents that when a Jew studies Torah, the Jew understands that this is indeed wisdom, but there's something greater than wisdom. This is the divine wisdom. This is the holiness of the Torah because the source of the Torah is from God himself. And so when a Jew approaches the Torah, he's not just seeking the wisdom of the Torah, he's also seeking the holiness of the Torah. He's seeking to connect to the divine author of the Torah. But that is something that's a Jewish spirit. When Talmai read the Torah, when the Gentiles come and read the Torah, they're looking for the wisdom. They're looking for the Torah, they're looking for the wisdom. They're not looking for what precedes the wisdom. And therefore, the Torah that they get is really the aleph, is number 1. They have nothing before it. So it's fascinating to see this insight here, how the Jewish people are uniquely positioned to be able to be open to the godliness and holiness that is within the Torah. Other people, maybe may not be as interesting to them because they can't necessarily relate to it. So they're looking for only exclusively for the wisdom within the Torah. And from that perspective, it just aligns when the rabbis were first forced to translate the Torah into Greek, which is the first Jewish translation into the Torah. It turned out that they made the change and they started the Torah with an aleph, and this signifies in some sense that the concept of being able to recognize that this holiness within the Torah is not so simple. It's a Jewish trait. Hopefully we can spread the message, but at least at that point, Talmai was not open to that knowledge that there's something beyond wisdom. You see, he was a Greek king, and the Greeks, they worship wisdom. And the concept that there's something that transcends wisdom, that the Greeks couldn't understand, that was a uniquely Jewish idea. So that's just something touching upon the beginning of the Torah, of how come the Torah starts with an aleph and does not start. Well, how come the Torah starts with a bet and not with an aleph? Okay, another point to contemplate here is that if you look at the version that they wrote to Talmai, that sounds like a better version. God created in the beginning. So you start the Torah with God. So that seems like a beautiful way to start the Torah. So how come, why is it that in our translation, in the authentic, in other words, in the Torah itself, God is only the third word? If you look at the translation into Greek that the rabbis wrote for Talmud, here God was the first word. So we discussed how come the Torah starts with a bet and now with an aleph, but now we're looking at it from another angle. Wouldn't it be more beautiful to start the Torah with an aleph and write Elohim? God starts with an aleph. I'm sorry, wouldn't it be more beautiful to start the Torah with the mention of God? God created in the beginning. Instead, we talk about in the beginning, created God. In other words, in the beginning, God created. In other words, we begin with the beginning instead of beginning with the word God. So there are various interpretations of why the Torah sets up the phraseology in this way. I'm just going to mention one or two, and then we'll go a little deeper. Maybe we'll read the Nachmanides. If we have a chance, we'll read it inside. If I can share the screen. So let's think about God for a second. What the Torah is telling us is ultimately, it's very difficult for us to understand and relate to God because God is infinite and we're finite. So it's almost impossible for us to actually have a relationship with God and understand what God is, even though we understand intellectually that there's something that transcends our finite reality. But it's hard for us to have a recognition in what this concept of God means. So therefore, the Torah starts, it doesn't mention God, because at that point, starting with God, nobody knows what God is. So the Torah is hinting to us that one way of understanding God is by looking at the world, by looking at nature, by looking at creation. When you look at creation, you can deduce that if there is a great piece of art, you understand that there's an artist is the source of the art. So in other words, in the beginning of the Torah, we don't yet know about God. If I start the sentence with God, what is God? I have no idea, right? The essence of God is not really discussed in the Torah until we get to later on in the story, once we increase in our wisdom. But in the beginning, if I say God, what does God mean? We don't know what God means. So therefore, the Torah begins by saying, in the beginning created. In other words, in the beginning, there was a creation. Who created the creation? That was God. What is God in the beginning of the Torah? In the beginning of the Torah, God is the author of creation. God is the artist that creates the creation. That's human beings could understand. I look outside, I see nature, I see the universe, I see the solar system, I see life, whatever I see. Now I can understand. I see the creation, I can deduce that there's a creator. But does that define what the creator is? No, not at all. The creator is far beyond that. But we don't know that. We don't yet have a deep understanding in what the definition of God is. And that's why the beginning of the Torah, it doesn't start with the word God, it starts with the word creation. Because from the creation, that is what leads us to God. If you track the first Jew, Abraham's path to God did not come through revelation, right? With Moshe experienced revelation. So there are some great sages and great characters in the story of the Torah whose path to God begins with revelation. But at least according to the Medrash, Abraham's path to God does not begin with revelation. Abraham's path to God begins by exploration, scientific exploration, looking at the world and trying to figure out what is the source of everything. And ultimately, he comes to the recognition that everything must have a source, and the source must be outside of the creation, and the source is the creator. So in other words, the path to God, at least initially, the path to God is through contemplating the creation. And therefore, the Torah starts with the word, in the beginning, there was a creation created by God. Now, that's the definition of God that we're working with in the beginning of the Torah, because that's the definition that we work with in the beginning of the Torah, because at that point, that's what we know about God. That's the easiest way to connect to God. So just to summarize, we've mentioned two ideas. We mentioned the fact that the Torah starts with a bet and not with an aleph, because the Torah that we study is already the second dimension, is the second concept. Before we even sit down to study Torah, there's something that precedes that. What precedes the Torah as we read it? What precedes the Torah as we read it? The Torah as we read it is the wisdom of the Torah. And what precedes that is the recognition of the holiness of the Torah, that Torah has divine wisdom. Torah connects us to the divine. That recognition is number one. And that has to precede the study of the Torah. Like I said, that's more difficult for at least the Greeks to understand, because the Greeks understood, they thought that wisdom is superior, and wisdom is the highest quality a person could achieve. They didn't believe in spirituality and godliness. They didn't believe in anything that transcends logic. And therefore, for them, logic is number one. So it turned out that when the rabbis translated the Torah into Greek, they set it up that logic, that the Torah begins with number one. The Torah that we have today, the Torah we understand, is number one. But for the Jewish people, the Torah that we read, the logic that we find in the Torah is number two. Because when we come to the Torah, we're coming for, number one is the connection to God, and number two is the logic. But the logic is number two. It follows the connection to the Torah, or the connection to God. So that's one point to make. Another point we discussed is the concept of why we don't reverse the order and start the Torah with God. God created in the beginning. And instead we say, in the beginning, if you want to do it literally, in the beginning, they're created God. God created, in other words, the beginning, God created. Why do we start with the beginning and created and then mention God? Because this is telling us that at this point in the game, the way we get to God, the way we understand God, or at least a path to connect to God, is the path of looking at the universe, seeing nature, and being able to see that the complexity and the beauty and of nature, and understanding that if there is something so complex and so beautiful, it has to have a creator, and to say that it's random is not necessarily the most logical explanation. Okay, with that, if anybody wants to comment, we'll comment, unmute all. Anybody can say hi, and anybody can say hello, say good morning, share something.
I do have a question, Rabbi. Yes. I don't know who's speaking.
Go ahead, Beth.
Is there any relationship to the letter bet and the word home, that we're being welcomed into God's home?
Bayit. Yes, bet is related to Bayit. That's a beautiful thing. So the Torah begins with the bet because creation, what is the definition of creation? The definition of creation is creating home to God. That's wonderful. That's a beautiful interpretation. But I would say again, that home would be welcomed. You were being welcomed into God's home. But again, why don't you tell me something about God? Forget about the creation. Before you tell me about the creation, tell me about God. The answer is that you don't always know about God. What do we know about God? The easiest way to understand God is by seeing the creation. Once we see the creation, we can understand God.
I have a question.
Yes.
Was the one beginning, or there were two beginnings? One beginning of our world and another beginning of God. Did God exist before beginning of our world?
Okay, good question. For that, I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to mute everybody so I can hear myself. That's a good question. Talk about the beginning. What's at the beginning? Now, this becomes a very difficult question to answer, just simply because the greatest philosophers are trying to figure out what is. If you talk about the beginning, you'd have to talk about time. What is the meaning and definition of time? Right? A Brief History of Time, I think, is a book that's a bestseller. So let's talk about, from the Jewish perspective, time and space be connected to, even before Einstein, we've been connecting the two, time and space. Time and space are both a created entity. Now, excuse me just one second. No? Okay. We cannot necessarily, everything that we understand, we're created beings, so we live within the realm of time and space. We cannot understand something that's outside of time and space. However, from the Jewish perspective, philosophically, time and space are itself a creation. And so the definition of time was created. There's a point where it sounds a little strange to say for us to understand, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's a point where before time, God exists, time does not exist. Now, I was going to say this later, but I'll say it now. there are various names of God in the Torah. There are about 7 names of God in the Torah, 7 holy names, and then there are other titles. And then there's the name that there's two common names, and the 2 most common ones in the beginning of Genesis is Elohim and Hashem, what we call Hashem, which literally means the name, but it's the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God. So Elohim we'll talk about later, but what is the name Hashem? Hashem's the essential name of God is really, it's 4 letters, Yud Kei Vav Kei. What does Yud Kei Vav Kei mean? So the rabbis explain that Yud Kei Vav Kei literally means, it comes from the word Haya Hoveh V'Yihiyeh, past, present, and future. Was, literally it's was, is, and will be. So if you have to define God, how would you define God? There are different definitions to God. I will talk about Maimonides' definition in a minute. But if you have to define God, how would you define God? So one definition is God is past, present, and future in one. In simple English, God transcends time. Now, I don't understand what that means, because everything I understand, I only understand within time. So unequivocally, the answer to your question is, before time was created, there was God. Do I understand that? No. But that's a definition of God's name. So now when you say the beginning of what? So the beginning is the beginning of any point, the beginning of the creation of time and space. That had a beginning. Everything has a beginning except for God. So that is a fascinating point, and I'll try to elaborate upon it a little bit. I'll start with a joke. I'll start with a story. Why is it a story? It's a good story, not because it's, I'll tell you the story. Okay, here's the story. Most people here heard my story, but I'll say it anyway. Story is as follows. There's a few Jewish people living in a small town in Eastern Europe, and they hear that there's a new invention. It's called a locomotive. What's the locomotive? Locomotive is that there is this wagon that can ride without horses. Now, this is an impossibility. Wagons, for thousands of years, wagons can only be pulled with horses. There's no such thing as a wagon without horses. It's like a flying car. You know, when I was growing up in the 80s, by 2000, we're going to have flying cars. I'm still in 2020, still waiting for the flying cars. I haven't seen many flying cars yet. But in any case, wagons don't go without horses. It's a scientific impossibility. So they sent a group of scholars from the small town to Moscow to see this wonder, to see and investigate, is there indeed a locomotive? Could a wagon drive without a car? I'm going to do you a favor. I'll say the story quickly. I heard it took me about an hour when I heard the story. I'll save you some time. In short, they go to Moscow, they see it, they come back to the small town, they gather all the Jews into the synagogue, and they say, we figured this out. We cracked the code. Yes, indeed, there's a locomotive, a car that drives without a wagon, but we can explain it to you. So everyone's there, everyone's trying to understand. They say, look, there's 100 cars in this train, okay? Car number 1 is driving. How does car number 1 drive? Very simple. Car number 2 pushes car number 1. Wonderful, because problem solved. Fine. So someone raises his hand. Yes, he says, yeah, but what about car number 2? How does car number 2 drive? He says, car number 2 is very simple. Car number 3 pushes car number 2. What's so hard to understand? And then someone else raises his hand and says, yeah, but what about car number 3? How does car number 3 move? Well, it's very simple. 4 moves 3. And they so on and so forth. By the time they get to car 50, car 60, car 70, the kids are crying. Everybody's going home for supper. Everybody's already shifting out. The crowd is dwindling out. By the time they get to car 98, there's one old Jew in the back, okay? So the guy raises his hand and says, yeah, I understand. How does car 99 move? He says, oh, car 99 is very simple. Car 100 pushes car 99. Okay, problem solved. What's the problem? Okay, fine. So he says, I have one more question. Thank you so much for your time. I have one more question. He says, how does car 100 move? So the scientists say, look. I explained to you 99% of the problem. 1% you don't understand. You go home, 1% you don't understand. What's the problem? So why is this funny? Because it's funny because we didn't explain 99%. You explained 0%. All you did is you pushed the question back. From car 100 to car 99, car 2, car 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 100. You didn't explain anything, you just pushed it back. What are we saying here? We're saying here that what am I trying to say? I'm trying to get at that what is the philosophical definition of God? I gave you the spiritual definition of God or the transcendent definition of God that transcends time. But what's the philosophical definition of God? Let's say Maimonides' definition of God. So why does philosophy, why does logic dictate that there must be a God? So logic would say that cause and effect is a logical concept. So everything that exists, you have to ask, what's the cause? What's its cause? And you go back and back and back. But eventually you have to say, what's the cause of that? So I like to say that the theory of evolution, the Big Bang, what do? We move the question back 15 billion years. So we explain, and we say we explain 99% of the cars. 15 billion years we can explain. But what preceded the Big Bang? What brought those materials into existence? We don't know. Okay, so we explain 99% of the equation. We didn't explain 1%. You didn't explain the most important percent. The most important question is, what is the origin of everything? That's what we didn't explain. So what I'm trying to get at is that everything that exists, you ask, where does that come from? Now, a very common question when you speak to children about God, if you ever did, they say, who created God? Right? Because they're using logic. And logic is everything has to have a source. So if everything comes from God, who created God? So the reason why that's not an accurate question, or why the question is not a good question, is because the definition of God from the philosophical perspective is the way Maimonides calls it is mechuyav hametziut, something that must exist. In other words, the problem that God comes to solve, the philosophical problem that God comes to solve, is that the question is, what's the source of everything? What's the answer? The answer is there's something that's the source of everything. Okay, who created that source of something? No, that doesn't need a source. That is the source of everything. That must exist. There cannot be a scenario where this does not exist. If there's a scenario where this could not exist, then your question is, so why does it exist? So Maimonides divides all of reality into two categories. There's something that must exist, and there's something that could exist. In Hebrew, it's mechuyav hametziut, something that must exist, and then there's efshari hametziut, something that has the possibility of existence. So all of existence, there's a possibility. If God creates it, it exists. But God must exist. And if God must exist, then you cannot ask who created it. This is something that was always here, will always be here, it must exist. Can I explain this to you? Not necessarily. But again, the philosophical definition of God, if Aristotle believed in God, he believed that there's something that always existed and must exist. Because if you don't say that element of something that must exist, then it's not God. If it doesn't must exist, then the question is, so why is it here to begin with? So why am I saying this? I'm saying that when you say Bereshit, the beginning, ultimately, what's the beginning of everything? Ultimately, beginning means there was a time where there's a starting point. A starting point is already creation, because the only thing that does not have a starting point is God. Why? Because God's the only thing that must exist. So again, the idea of Bereshit, you think about the beginning, it must be the beginning of creation. And creation here, we don't just mean the creation of our solar system or our universe. We mean a creation of time and space, of anything that has a beginning, anything that does not must exist. God himself, however, is not a creation. God himself, according to the language of Maimonides, it's mechuyav hametziut, he must exist. If he must exist, then to say what happened before you were created, no, you must exist. That's the definition of God. So asking who created God is like saying, could something that must exist not be here? No, it's a contradiction in terms. The definition of God is something that must exist. If it must exist, then it always must exist. If it only exists at a certain point, then it must exist. So then it's not God. So that explains the concept of Bereshit, the beginning. If it has a beginning, it's not God. The world, creation, has a beginning. God himself has no beginning. The definition of God, like I said, is he must exist, which means he always exists. Which means he also transcends time, and therefore for God, he's outside of time. If he's outside of time, then past, present, and future are all one. So I just finished saying a lot of things here that I'm not sure I completely understand, but I'm sort of just conveying it. I'm just conveying the message. But I'm happy to, if anybody wants to elaborate or add insight, because I'm not sure I myself understood everything I just said. But here we go.
But that could explain why Torah starts with the beginning, because this way it starts with God and not with
Yeah,
God.
but we're signaling to you that everything we know is number two. What's number one? Number one, there are things that precede our ability to understand because we are in time and space, right? So Bereshit bara Elokim, you look around and you say, there's a universe, there was creation. Is creation number one or number two? We say creation is number two. What precedes number two? God. What's God? He always must exist. But we don't really understand what that means because we are within time and space. And the definition of time and space is that there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. There's past, present, and future. So to tell me that we understand, we can talk directly about something that transcends time is very difficult for us to understand. So the Torah just alludes to it. It almost leaves it out. But it tells you that what we're going to talk about is number two. What's number one? You'll figure it out. It's something that precedes what you're able to understand.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I've heard in the past you talk about the word Breshit derives from bara, which is to create, which is a unique form of creation,
Yes.
suggesting something from nothing as opposed to what anyone else could do, which is making something different from something.
Correct.
So in addition to understanding Bereshit from a perspective of time, before, beginning, after, could we also understand it as an allusion to what it was that existed, and that before it was all spiritual, and in the beginning means the creation of material?
Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about the word the Bereshit in a minute, what exactly Bereshit means and why it's a very problematic word. But it's clear, it's not clear, at least according to Rashi, Bereshit, the problem with Bereshit is as follows. We translate Bereshit as the beginning. In the beginning, God created. The problem is that Bereshit is not the beginning. Bereshit is the beginning of. The word Reshit always must be connected to something else. So it's Bereshit is the beginning of, which makes the verse a little grammatically problematic. We'll discuss that. But by this definition, Bereshit is the beginning of creation, but it's not the beginning. In other words, it's not the starting point of everything. There's something before this. What's before this? Before this is God. Before this is that which must exist. So what is this? This is the beginning of creation. Do you see what I'm saying?
It also, Bereshit, it's Mark. It's two beginnings.
Yeah, so Rashi discusses. Yeah, there's midrashic interpretations of Bereshit, two in the beginning. We'll get to that in a moment. But whatever the case is, Bereshit is moving forward. Bereshit puts us. It continues to. It doesn't go back. It goes forward. In other words, it's the beginning of something. It's not the beginning of everything. It's not the starting point. The Torah is not telling us about the starting points. There is no starting point. The starting point is God that must exist. The beginning is the beginning of creation, not the beginning of reality. Reality is God. God has no beginning.
I just want to quickly ask something which is a change of subject, but maybe you could raise it at the end, because we have Passover coming this week. And I had heard, and maybe you could talk a little bit, try and connect this with Passover at the very end. But I had heard something this week about how there's some Kabbalistic interpretation that Passover actually preceded creation. I don't know if that's come up in anything you've.
We talked briefly on I think it was Thursday about it. I don't want to get too carried away with it, but I'll jump right. I'm gonna go into it because it talks about. It's related to us. So those who are here on Thursday, I apologize for the repetition. But before I go there, I just want to say one thing. If you know what the bet looks like, I don't know if people know what the bet looks like. The bet, here, let's see. I'm going to draw on my artistic skills over here.
Like Karl Rove with his whiteboard.
Okay. Let's say, can you see? Okay. So this is your bet. This is a bet, and it's Hebrew. So we read from right to left. Okay, we read from right to left. What's interesting about the bet is that the bet does not let you go. It's open only forward. It's not open backward. In other words, when you start reading the Torah, it's the beginning of creation. It's moving you this way. What happens that way? You're stuck. You're stuck in a barrier. What's the barrier? It's hard for us to understand what precedes the beginning of creation. What's the barrier? The barrier is to understand something that transcends time and space, that there's something before time. That's a certain barrier. So we understand that the letter Bet, as the word Bereshit, the Bereshit, like I said, even grammatically, the way the letter looks, but also grammatically, Bereshit is the beginning of. Beginning of means the story is continuing. It's not taking us back. It's taking us forward, if you see what I'm saying. In the beginning of this story, this is what happened. What happened before the story? We're not discussing that. It's the beginning of something. The beginning of something is moving forward, not moving back. Because there's a certain barrier, like I said, that is hard for us to understand. Now, the Greeks wouldn't accept this. The Greeks would say logic is everything. The rabbi is not talking logic. Throw him off, mute him, throw him off the Zoom, right? And that's why with the Greeks, indeed, when they get the Torah, it starts with an aleph, because everything has to be understood. But when we get together, we understand that we're starting from the Bet. We're starting from logic, with the beginning of the story, I understand, but we accept that there's something that precedes the story. What precedes the story? God that always exists. Something, how could something always exist? We can't understand it. Okay, but that's what we're comfortable making peace with things that we can't necessarily grasp fully. Okay, Mark wants us to connect us to Passover, so I'm going to connect it to Passover, but it's going to be a little bit repetitious for those who were here Thursday, but okay, Nish Gefarlach, like I say in Yiddish, is not terrible. I'll try to be brief. I hope I don't, yeah. Okay, so we believe, who mentioned, I think Andy mentioned that the word bara means something from nothing, which means to say that according to the Hebrew definition of creation, there's a point where there's nothing. Nothing means nothing physical, or nothing, no matter, no energy, nothing physical. And then God at a certain point creates something from nothing. That's the definition of creation. We can elaborate upon that when we get to the next word. You see, we're still stuck in the first word of the Torah. Soon we'll get to the second word of the Torah, and we'll talk about the concept of creation ex nihilo, something from nothing. But we'll jump ahead to the second word just to connect it to Passover. So we say that creation is something from nothing. Nothing means there's not cause and effect, right? It's not like something would evolve. It's not like there was one matter and the matter evolves. That's true from the beginning at a certain point, but before that there was no matter at all. Okay, like I said Thursday, the Greek philosophers believed in a creator. In other words, what they call the prime mover. There's a God who sets everything into motion. However, they believe that matter itself always existed. The whole speech that I told you about God, that God is a mechuyav hametziyut, that God must exist, and therefore you cannot ask the question who created God, because God must exist. The Greeks would tell you the same speech about matter. Matter always exists. It must exist, and it's always here. It's just like God in that sense. And then what is God's job? God is the job to start the process of the evolution of the matter to get to the world as we know it today. That's what God, so God comes, starts, gives it a kick, gives it a jolt, gives it a big bang, and that's when it starts developing, and then God can go to sleep. We actually don't need God, and that's why they believe God is not involved in creation. God is just sort of starts the process. But they believe matter was always here. The language of the philosophers, the way it's recorded in the Jewish books of philosophy, they thought that the olam, that the world, the matter, is kadmon. Kadmon means it's early, it always existed. We say no. We say only God is a kadmon, only God always exists, and the world is, like Andy says, is created ex nihilo, is created from nothing by God himself. So there was a point where the world does not exist. There was a point where the world there was no existence at all. And this is a very deep disagreement that lasted for thousands of years. And I said Thursday that my limited understanding of science tells me that the Big Bang Theory is actually agrees with the Jewish perspective versus the Greek perspective. So for 1,500 years, the Jews were laughed at for believing that the world is ex nihilo. The world has a beginning. There's a starting point. because the common understanding was, no, the world always existed. Now, when you have Big Bang Theory tells you there's a starting point. Okay, it's not exactly what we're saying, but it's much closer to what we're saying, what the Jews are saying, than what the Greeks were saying. In other words, there is a beginning point. Okay, that's just parenthetically. What's the psychological ramifications of arguing whether or not the world always existed? Like, what's at stake? Who cares? So there's many ways of answering that. If the world always existed, then the world is a god. So there are two gods. We don't like two gods for various reasons. But another way of thinking about this is, if the world always existed, if the matter always existed, then God is limited by the matter in this primordial soup, right? So there's some matter here, there's some existence here. All God can do is trigger that, set that into motion. But the properties of that creation, God has no control over those properties, because they're not dependent on God. They were created they were always here. So ultimately, God is not all powerful. Nature has certain rules that cannot be changed. If you believe, however, that God is the only thing that's a kadmon that always existed, and the world didn't always exist, so there are no built-in properties into nature that cannot change, that always exist, then when God creates the world, then there are no rules. In other words, ultimately, he's not trapped. He can create any matter he wants, and if he created it, he could change it. He's not limited by it. So philosophically speaking, this is where we get the concept of freedom. Because what does freedom mean? Freedom means I am not trapped by nature, right? I wake up in the morning and I have a bad habit. So there's two things I can tell myself. I could tell myself, this is who I am, I cannot change. By the way, it's not a bad excuse. When I lose my temper and my wife says, why are you so angry? I say, this is my nature. What do you want me to do? You want me to suppress my nature? This is who I am. This is my nature. I cannot change. It's actually a pretty good line of defense. It works most times. Not always, but most time it works. This is who I am. So if I say this is who I am, this is my nature, and I can't change my nature, that's the definition of enslavement. I'm not free. I'm not free to change who I am. In other words, nature gives me this raw material, and then I'm stuck. I'm stuck within the parameters of the properties of that nature. If, however, I believe that all of nature was created by God, and ultimately God is free, God could make miracles, which means God could make the unexpected happen. Then if God can make the unexpected happen, God empowers me to make the unexpected happen. So even if my nature is to be impatient, but I'm not trapped by that nature, because nature is not a constant. Nature could change. So if nature could change, then I could change. So in some sense, the concept of freedom, people wake up in the morning today and they say, we could change, we could be better, we can do better, we can improve. These are very radical ideas. They're ideas that come from the Torah. They cannot be traced to anywhere else. The concept that we could change who we are is a radical idea. By the way, I think Beth will correct me. Now, a current psychology is falling back into the old model, saying we can change, we're stuck in our ways. And that is dangerous, because what that does means if I can't change, then there's no morality. Because the whole concept of morality is that I'm responsible for my actions. But I'm only responsible for my actions if I have some sort of choice. But if I don't have any choice, then I'm not free, then I don't have choice, then I'm not responsible for my actions, then there's no morality. So it's becoming more common today in the world of psychology, certainly on college campuses, to preach that we don't have any control. And we're all a product of our environment or our nature. But this is antithetical to Judaism. And Judaism believes that we're free, for the most part, as long as we're healthy people. We're not mentally incompetent. But as long as we're healthy people, we are free. But this concept of freedom is traced all the way back to the idea that there's nothing in nature that's set in stone. You know, there was nothing in reality that would bind God. If the world, however, was a kadmon, was a constant, was always here, then God doesn't really have too much control over nature, over the world. All he can do, all his job is to set the world into the nature into motion, but the properties of nature itself, God has no control over. From that perspective, there's much less freedom of the person to change there's much less room for believing that we are free to change and we have free choice. So the concept, if we walk around thinking we have a certain degree of free choice, we have a certain degree of autonomy, we have morality, we have moral free choice, these are radical ideas, and they stem from this, ultimately, if you trace them back to their source, they can be traced back to this big debate of, does the world always exist, or does the world have a beginning? If the world always existed, that means that there are certain things that are stuck in place. If the world has a beginning, that means everything was created by God. That means that God could help you and encourage you to change. So this is the connection to Passover. Again, these are deep philosophical concepts. I'm not necessarily saying I understand everything I'm conveying here, but I'm trying to at least convey the teachings and the writings. Okay, if anybody wants to jump in, now is the chance.
Rabbi, it's Warren. I do have a question. I'm trying to understand better. I'm looking at the image, and I'm looking at the first sentence in English. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty, suggesting that in the beginning of the process of creation, there was something called the earth, which was astonishingly empty with darkness upon the surface of the deep, and the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters. So you have earth and waters. And then I'm looking at the footnote number 1, which says that there's a disagreement between, it sounds like it's a disagreement between Rashi and another sage, Ibn Ezra, and the Ramban, and about the sequence, and that the translator of in the Chumash accepted Rashi's view. So can you clear this up for me?
Yeah. So I alluded to it earlier. We'll get to the Ramban in a minute. We're going to cover all of this hopefully in the weeks to come. But just to start, to begin the process of exploration here. The Rashi, if you read your translation, it says, if I remember correctly, in the beginning of God's creation. Am I right? What's the sentence? What's the English first sentence? I think it's in the beginning of. I think it's Warren. I think you said it's in the beginning of God's creation. Am I right about that? Okay, unless you contradict me, I think I'm right about that, Warren. So, like I said, most people think the translation is in the beginning God created. That's Bereshit bara Elokim. That's what the verse you heard. In the beginning God created. Rashi says that is an accurate translation. Why is it an inaccurate translation? Because the word Bereshit always means in the beginning of. It doesn't mean in the beginning, it means in the beginning of. Going back to what we're discussing here. Is the Torah talking about the beginning of everything? No. The beginning of everything is God. We're not talking about God. We're talking about the beginning of. What's the beginning of? So Rashi explains what it means is in the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, the earth was astonishingly empty. That's the way Rashi reads the verses. Nachmanides disagrees. We'll get to Nachmanides later. But you see what Rashi is doing here. What Rashi is doing here is, this is not talking to you about the beginning, and it's not even telling you the whole story about the beginning of creation. What it's telling you is, in the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, there was a point where the earth was astonishingly empty, and etc. Verse 3 is God says, let there be light, and there was light. What Rashi is doing here is telling you is, we're not discussing, like I said, we're not discussing the beginning per se, because the beginning per se is God. We're discussing the beginning of creation. That's Rashi's interpretation, and that's the way I believe you probably have the Art Scroll. I don't think you have the Art Scroll. In any case, that sounds like what the English translation of that parsha, of that verse, follows Rashi. Bereshit is not in the beginning, it is in the beginning of. Nachmanides takes the verse a little bit different, and Nachmanides talks about, let's put it on the board. Why not? I think I have a copy of Nachmanides. I'm going to put him on the screen. I'm going to try to share the screen, and we'll read a little bit about Nachmanides, and we'll see what Nachmanides says. It's a relatively famous piece of Nachmanides. Let's just see if I can find this guy.
Rabbi, can I ask a question or should I wait?
Please.
Well, the way I understand this, God starts every day, it's a new day. Hello?
Yeah, I'm listening.
That's the beginning. And if we start looking backwards and asking ourselves what came first, creation or God, we actually are being trapped by that question. And we can't go forward, which is what, the way I understand this, we are supposed to do.
Yes, there is a certain truth to what you're saying. The Mishnah in Shakeh Chagiga says that there are 4 things a person cannot understand. And one of them is malafanim, what's before the beginning. In other words, at a certain point, to ask myself, what is the beginning of reality, and contemplate the concepts of how the world, what existed before time existed, ultimately is a little bit futile, because a person is not going to be productive, because we can't really truthfully assimilate and understand that. So a lot of life is about going forward. In other words, let's focus on what we could understand. And in that sense, you're right. But in the beginning of the story, we recognize that what we understand is number 2. Preceding number 2 is number 1. How much we understand of number 1, how much we should focus on number 1 is another question. But we have to understand that our perception of reality is not.
Faith is not. Faith is
very good. Faith is that which transcends understanding. Certain things we could understand, and certain things we accept. And we accept them on faith, not because they don't make sense. They make sense, they're logical, but they're things that our mind cannot comprehend. We cannot understand what it means to be before time and space. But you're right. That's why the Torah, like I said, the Torah is with a bet. Bet means move forward. We're focusing on the creation. That's what we can understand. And like I said before, one of the Medrash says, best way of coming close to understanding God, there's 2 ways to come, multiple ways to come close to God. One is the philosophical approach, trying to figure out what precedes time, what's the definition of time, philosophically speaking. Another way is simply looking at nature, right? Moving forward. If you see nature, if you see the creation, then you can deduce that there's something preceded creation, which is God. Okay, I want to read a little bit from Nachmanides to get back to Warren's question, and to talk about what is the difference between the way Nachmanides reads it and the way Rashi reads it. But again, Rashi reads the verse to mean in the beginning of, saying that, like I said, we're not talking about the beginning, we're talking about the beginning of creation. And that's why he doesn't the English translation doesn't translate in the beginning God created, which is probably the more common translation, but the version you have says more accurately, according to Rashi, in the beginning of creation. Okay, I'm going to read at least one paragraph from Nachmanides, and this will conclude. Here we go. And now, in the beginning, and now listen to the correct and clear explanation of the text according to its simple understanding, Pshuta. In other words, he says Rashi is saying the beginning of. Nachmanides says, let's stay simple. Here we go. The Holy One, blessed be He, created all of the creations from absolute nothingness. This is also Andy alluded to this Nachmanides. From absolute nothingness. Oh, I thought I unmuted everybody. Whoops. And we have no other expression in the holy tongue for bringing out something from nothing than bara. In other words, in Hebrew, the word bara has an exclusive meaning. It means creating something from nothing. And we elaborate upon this at other times. The Hebrew word for what we would call creative in Hebrew is a different word. It doesn't mean bara, it means yatsar, to form. Because when we're creative, you say this person is so creative. They're not that creative. What they're doing is they're forming. They're taking one material and changing its form to another material. To create literally is to create something from nothing. Says Nachmanides, the word bara, the second word of the Torah. In the beginning, it was bara. That is something that is uniquely bringing something from nothing. And none of all that which was made under the sun or above existed directly from nothing. In other words, now he's moving on to the continuation of the verses. In the beginning, there was creation, something from nothing. The heaven and earth didn't start from nothing. Rather, he brought out a very fine element from complete nothingness, It has no substance, but it is the energy that can create, that is able to accept a form and to go from the potential to the actual. And this is the first material, and it is called Hiyuli by the Greeks. And after Hiyuli, he didn't create anything, but rather formed and made the creations. Since it is from it that he brought everything forth and clothed the forms and refined them. So next week we'll continue and read the continuation of Nachmanides. But what Nachmanides is saying so far is as follows. What Nachmanides is saying is that in the beginning there was a Bereshit, there was a beginning, there was a creation, something from nothing. And then he says that something from nothing, there was what the Greeks called Hiyuli, the undefined matter. And this undefined matter becomes heaven and earth. But how does it become heaven and earth? For that you have to look at verse 2. And in verse 2, he talks about the process of how you get from the undefined matter to the heaven and the earth. And we'll continue reading Nachmanides and we'll continue reading the Torah and we will explain. But just to summarize is that Rashi says we're not talking about the beginning, we're talking about the beginning of. In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, because the word Bereshit is the beginning of. Nachmanides says something similar, but he says it in different words. What he says is that Bereshit, in the beginning there was bara. In the beginning there was creation. There was something from nothing. And that was the end. After that there was no more something from nothing. Everything else that we know of heaven and earth was not created directly something from nothing. Rather, it came from sort of an evolutionary process. And those who accept the Big Bang Theory love Nachmanides. As we will see, Nachmanides really believes that the world did come about in an evolutionary system. In other words, it moves from the simple to the more complex, as we will explain. But that's it for today. Just to summarize, and I just want to mention that it's the Rebbe's birthday, so my daughter would like, with your permission, she would like to share a little PowerPoint with a teaching from the Rebbe about Passover. So if you have 3-4 minutes to indulge us, that would be appreciated. But going back just to summarize, so what are some of the concepts we discussed today? We discussed the concept of why this Torah starts with a bet and not with an aleph. We discussed the concept of why the Torah, we discussed the concept of why the Torah begins with the word Bereshit within the beginning instead of talking about God, because ultimately we can't know God directly. We only know God through looking at the creation. We also talked about the story of Talmai, and we discussed the concept of beginning and how everything has a beginning except for God, because God is mechuyav hametziut, God must exist. And we also talked about how that would affect our concept of freedom if the world does not have to exist as it exists. That liberates us, that gives us the ability to experience freedom, because we're not locked into any specific model. So it's 10:29. We'll give 1 minute for questions, if anybody wants to say anything, and then we'll have the great privilege of hearing from Mushka.
Does the word Bereshit show up anywhere else in the Tanakh?
Bereshit does, quite a few places, and we'll discuss it next week. But the word bara, never. The word bara almost exclusively shows up in the context of something from nothing. So that's Nachmanides' big idea. Nachmanides' big idea is the way we use creative in English is not the way the Bible uses creative. When we want to say someone is creating, the Bible has another word for that. It's called yatsar, which is to form. Creation is something from nothing.
Rabbi, is there any hint that this beginning is a universal beginning, or is it particularly hidden that it's a Jewish beginning?
It's the beginning of all of creation.
But is it a universalistic? Is this an agnostic beginning, or is there a hint that this is really God's way of starting a Jewish beginning?
I think that from the Jewish perspective, creation is universal. In other words, it's certainly a divine creation. The third word of the Torah is God. We attribute the creation to God. But is this God a God specifically of the Jews? No, this is the God. God is a universal God. So the story of creation is relevant to all of humanity. Later on, we'll read about the story of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus is more related to the Jewish people. The story of Genesis is again creation by God, but it's really the universal. It's sort of God creating all of the world. So it's universally relevant.
Thank you.